Like my friend, Noble Lord Wilson, I had the privilege of being governor of Hong Kong for 5 years, the greatest privilege I've ever had. The joint declaration incorporating one country, two systems was an extraordinarily clever, adept way of coping with an issue which was politically and morally difficult, both for China and for the United Kingdom. Morally difficult because for China, they knew that more than half the population of Hong Kong were refugees from the events in China under a communist regime. Morally difficult for Britain because it was pretty well our only colony that we weren't preparing for independence with democratic structures. When occasionally in the 60s and 70s, Britain talked about greater democracy in Hong Kong, Chinese officials, including, I think, famously Zhou Enlai, made it clear that they didn't want that. They didn't want that because it would give people in Hong Kong the idea that they were going to turn out something like Singapore one day, or Malaysia, an independent country. And moreover, it was always the Chinese government's position that the future of people in Hong Kong was nothing to do with the people of Hong Kong. It all had to be determined by the British and Chinese governments. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that for a dozen or more years after 1997, one country, two systems worked extraordinarily well. There was some rowing back by the Chinese government on the pledges they'd made on the introduction of greater democracy in Hong Kong, saying at a number of points that this was a matter for people in Hong Kong. They rowed back on that. The Joint Liaison Office, their main point of contact in Hong Kong, threw its weight around a bit too much, but by and large things went pretty well. And then I think the caesura in Hong Kong and in the development of China in the last few years has been the election of President Xi Jinping as head of the Communist Party and President of China. Just as that's changed attitudes to economic matters in China, I think it's had an impact on political issues as well. And certainly it's the case that there's been a tightening of Beijing's control over Hong Kong in the last few years. Now that's the backdrop to what has happened since the introduction, extraordinarily foolishly, of the extradition bill, which was seen not just by pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, but by the business community as well, as an attempt to dismember the firewall between the rule of law in Hong Kong and whatever it is that passes for the law. I note what Noble Lord Alton had to say, what passes for the law in mainland China. So we had the huge demonstrations which began peacefully and unfortunately have developed a violent edge in the last few months. And bear in mind, this has been going on for 4 months now. I would commend to the House an extremely good article written in Asian Affairs by a retired Hong Kong police officer about what has happened in dealing with those demonstrations. First of all, he pointed out that starting with the demonstrations on the 12th of June, which were around the government buildings, the police began to target not just the people who were behaving violently, but a lot of those who were being perfectly peaceful. Secondly, we had the appalling affair in the MTR station and Chun Long in July, when it was plainly the case that triads and other gangsters were used in order to beat up demonstrators and try to help in the policing. All those issues and the broader economic and social issues justify establishing a commission of inquiry, and that's been pressed for some months, including by the former Chief Justice Andrew Lee and by others, and I do think it's the most sensible way forward. I implore the government to do that in Hong Kong. I implore those who are demonstrating to recognize that they play into the hands of the Communist Party when they're violent. But you have to understand that when you say to them, you'll lose the moral high ground if you behave violently, they say, if we're on the moral high ground, who's going to be there with us? Who's going to be talking to us? Because nobody does address them. Nobody does try to form some sort of consensus with them. So and they're also, of course, extremely critical of the way that the demonstrations have been policed, which hasn't been the greatest example of what used to be, I think, and I hope still will be, the behaviour of a great Asian police force. I just want to say three things finally. First of all, I implore not just the demonstrators to give up any violence. I implore Beijing to give the government in Hong Kong, whether it's Carrie Lam or anybody else, the elbow room to actually make some accommodations with the demonstrators. Secondly, I implore the Chinese government to behave more sensibly in general. Most of us have received a rather impertinent letter this morning from the Foreign Ministry, which is a very good example of how the Chinese think that international laws, international treaties which they sign, have to be followed by everybody else but don't have to be followed by them. Lastly, I refer to the Foreign Minister saying all this has been whipped up by
distinguished speakers. Two things are evident from that. One is that in your Lordship's house there's a great deal of personal experience of Hong Kong, people who have lived there, people who have worked there. There's also a universal affection for Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong. And there is universally deep concern about what has been happening in Hong Kong over the last few weeks. And that surely can be no surprise. Weeks of demonstrations which initially started very peacefully with the majority of people, young people, who were clearly well-intentioned, very concerned about their own future, possibly not well-informed about what they might reasonably achieve, but with good intentions. And then increasing amount of violence. And that is a very distressing thing to see, not at all the way in which Hong Kong usually acts, going to be totally counterproductive and something which should not be tolerated. There's no occurrence that I can think of in Hong Kong of that degree of violence since, well, 50 years ago, 1967, during the Cultural Revolution, when there was very serious violence in Hong Kong. And then, incidentally, the Hong Kong police behaved with great steadfastness. Indeed, at the end of that year, so well had the Hong Kong police behaved that they were given the accolade of being called the Royal Hong Kong Police. Now, there's been a good deal of criticism of the police recently, and some of your lordships have shared that criticism. I noticed that my noble friend Lord Hogan Howe could see how difficult it is to carry out those sort of operations, and also probably how mistakes can be made, and those sort of mistakes need to be remedied. But it's worth remembering, I think, that not only have the police been under enormous strain, week after week, weekend after week, but their families have also been threatened, their children going to school have been threatened, and their position has been extremely difficult. My lords, I think it is clear enough that all of what has been going on is not just a consequence of the so-called extradition bill, the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance, as it's really properly called, widely misunderstood as it has been. I think a majority of those taking part in the demonstrations sincerely believed they might be picked up for something they'd said about the Chinese leadership and sent to mainland China for trial. Now, of course, it was extradition for alleged offences in mainland China, not picking up somebody who had allegedly done something in Hong Kong. And the people who were, in a way, rightly concerned were business people going into China who feared that there might be some artificial accusation against them by rivals, which would enable there to be a demand for them to be extradited to China. It was an ill-conceived measure. It is in the too difficult box, to put it mildly, and was not a sensible idea to put forward. But I think what it showed was that there was a great pile of dry timber in Hong Kong, and the extradition bill was the light that set that on fire, and it's remained on fire. Noble lords have referred to a number of the concerns that young people have about housing, about job opportunities, about their freedoms, about what simply would happen to them in the future. Would they lose some of the privileges they've got at the moment? And I think behind a lot of that has been a growing concern and worry about the extent of mainland China's involvement in Hong Kong. It's not a simple issue. My impression is that what tends to happen is that when there's a period of confusion in Hong Kong and uncertainty about what's happening, all sorts of different organizations in mainland China send their representatives into Hong Kong to find out what's happening, to influence what's happening if they can. And that begins to build up into a picture of much greater involvement in Hong Kong than should be the case. At the time of the signing of the joint declaration, there was a strapline or a slogan which was often put out from Peking, which was "Gang Ren Zhi Gang," which I'll translate as "Hong Kong people running Hong Kong." That seems to me to be an admirable objective. That was what it was said was going to be the future of Hong Kong after the implementation of the joint declaration, after the transfer of sovereignty. But what it needs is for the Hong Kong government to be effective in what it's doing, the Hong Kong Legislative Council to be effective in backing up or questioning the Hong Kong government, but a mechanism for putting into effect laws and decisions, and for the Hong Kong people to show that they can and are capable of running Hong Kong. It's now more than 22 years since Hong Kong was returned to Chinese sovereignty. It's now a special part, it's a unique part, but it is a part, nevertheless, as the noble Lord Howell said, of the People's Republic of China. There's been a number of references made by noble lords to the joint declaration. My impression, like the noble Lord Sassoon, is that the only clear-cut case of the breaking of the joint declaration has been the bookseller in Hong Kong, Li Bo, who was, without doubt, taken out of Hong Kong without legal process. He was kidnapped and taken to Hong Kong. But it would be interesting if the noble Lord, the Minister, could say whether the British government thinks that there have been other straightforward occasions of breaking of the joint declaration. I think it's worth saying, my lords, that although it's possible to say, as some Chinese officials have said, that the joint declaration is no longer applicable if you refer to the joint declaration as being just that bit which says that Britain will return to China sovereignty over Hong Kong. Only if you say that. The vast bulk of the joint declaration is in its annexes, and its annexes lay down in terms what are the policies of the People's Republic of China towards Hong Kong for 50 years. That is where, in great detail, my lords, it's written down precisely what that means. They are Chinese policies laid down there, and that remains applicable. It cannot not remain applicable. Just to revert, if I may, to our own role, since we no longer administer.
I'm sorry to intervene. I did extend the generosity with consulting the whips that we had heard longer than the time from the other former Governor-General of Hong Kong. But if
I'm so sorry.
The noble lord could now wrap up, although
yes,
we are not tight on time, I do want to be equal to both.
I'm so sorry. I would wrap up. What I would just like to say is we cannot and should not try to tell the Hong Kong government what to do, but we can hope for various things to happen. One would be a commission to look at the whole issue, which the noble Lord Patton referred to. We share the position of being the only two survivors of an extinct species, the governors of Hong Kong. And there are other things which could help to resolve the present situation. We must all hope it will be resolved soon for the good of Hong Kong and for all the people who live there.
Well, I thank the noble Lord, Lord Alton, for securing